Hey again, everybody. Welcome back to another installment of Speaking of Sundara, where I talk about my fantasy RPG setting, Sundara Dawn of a New Age, currently available for Pathfinder Classic or Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, so pick your poison, whichever one you prefer. Now, if you've been watching this series for a while, you know that I started off with a lot of the bigger, more involved things that I changed about the setting and the world that we were used to. And last week, I talked about Maud City of Bones, a abandoned ruin that had been resurrected by a guild of necromancers and turned back into a metropolis once more. But rather than talking about another one of the cities that I made, I wanted to take a moment to jump over to sort of the sister series that came out starting last fall, of Species of Sundara, where just as I had taken locations and expanded on them, I took the standard fantasy races we're used to playing with, or species as I call them in the title, and sort of gave them an extra flair for the setting, and did my part to sort of scrub off some of the rougher edges. Now, for those who haven't read the setting or haven't really listened to me talk about the philosophy behind it so far, the idea behind Sundara was not just to give everybody a fantasy setting where they could be more creative with their solutions to problems, but I also wanted to get rid of a lot of the tendency we have to lean on monoliths. If you've read any fantasy series, from Tolkien all the way up through Moorcock into D&D today, you see things like, elves have a shared language because no matter where you are, no matter what culture you're from, all of you speak Elvish. You have orcs who all worship the same god, no matter how far or how widespread their culture happens to be or how many deviations it's taken. And my goal was to kind of back up on that and to provide just more variety, more options, more choices, and to sort of make things feel more organic when it came to that kind of development. And it was really the second installment of that series I felt that people really responded to, which was my take on Dwarves. Now, for those who, again, haven't read it, it starts off with kind of a little bit of cultural mythology. Amongst the various dwarves, there is a creation myth, and it takes a lot of different forms and a lot of different styles. But generally speaking, the way dwarves are said to have been made, according to the most common stories, is that in the beginning, when the primordial giants were forming the world, they made as much of it as they could. They got down on their knees and dug the rivers, and they formed the mountains, and they blew clouds across the sky, all of those things. And then they realized they were too large to complete their work, so they had to make children of their own to take it forward and finish the task. And so each type of giant set forth to make children who were strong, who were clever, who would inherit their various gifts, and thus were made the dwarves. And so this kind of explained why dwarves in Sundara seem to have a very close affinity with one kind of element. It's also, lots of them will have a very, very tight-knit relationship with some of the younger giants, as they're called. The primordial beings used so much of their power to make dwarves as they are, that all that were left were these smaller races of giants, the ones we're more used to seeing in a CR9 to CR14 range. And it's debatable how much of that is truth and how much is just a nice story that's been told over and over and over again throughout the years. But because of that setup, it gave me and players and dungeon masters the option to go forth and make all sorts of different kinds of dwarves and cultures, and to sort of kickstart that process, I created 5 options, each one with its own language preference, its own cultures, its own customs, playable options for those who wanted to take different background traits or different subspecies, depending on which edition you're playing in. And I thought they were an interesting twist on a lot of what we see from just dwarves being that stereotypical mountain-dwelling creature with the Scottish accent and the battle axe and the big beard. And so I figured I'd get into those today, give sort of a brief overview of them, and if folks like them, the link to it should be down below. You can get whichever edition you prefer. Lots of the flavorful content is the same. It's really just the mechanics that change from one to the other. And so we started it off with the Takatori, which were given birth by the great fire giants. So we see them usually forming their cultures and communes around volcanic areas or places with lots of heat. For individuals who regularly read my blog, they were originally inspired by my question of what happens if you have a dwarven culture that surfs? And so, the Takatori, because of where they live, they don't wear big woolens and heavy tunics and whatnot, so they're usually just dressed in breechclout, bracers, belts, and they'll just be covered in tattoos to show family lineage, to show great deeds, things of that nature. And so Takatori tattoos are very well known, very well recognized, and in areas where they're common, very well respected. But you also see, their culture is very, very clannish, which is also traditionally dwarven. But their clans tend to be widespread and polyamorous, so it's very important for them to keep very careful track of who's related to whom, when, where, why, and how. And moving on from them, we have the Hasserata, which are given birth by the great stone giants. And these are more what a lot of us are used to when it comes to the attributes we think of when we think of fantasy dwarves. They live in the mountains, they have a great affinity with stone magic. Their communities tend to be, if not isolationist, at least difficult for outsiders to get to. But at the same time, there are elements of the better parts of ancient Greece in them, of they're less about, hard drinking and hard fighting and more about, long philosophical thoughts had in the gymnasium, in between bouts of wrestling and weightlifting and trying to perfect themselves, because their mastery of earth magics and their ability to do so much labor with, what is essentially magical mechanization allows them to refine craft, to refine scholarship, and they can use their extended lives to master all sorts of different trades and to see all kinds of amazing sights that other people would have to spend their time actually working on. And beyond the Hasserata, we have the Ganargon, who are the hill dwarves, which were, as one would expect, made by the hill giants. And so they're very rugged, very rough and tumble. They have kind of a if you could find dwarves in Wisconsin, the Ganargon are who you would find. They're very competitive, they love games, they love hospitality, and even though they're easier to approach than lots of other communities, they still tend to make their homes far out in the hinterlands as far as most people are concerned. But if you can find them, and if you undergo the rites of hospitality, you will find no better hosts and no better place to spend an evening. Although you might be challenged to a couple dozen arm wrestling competitions and at least one drinking contest depending on the time of year. And past them we have the Kraskar, who are very isolationist, found deep, deep in wetlands. They were made by the swamp giants, relatively few of whom are still around, and they tend to be off-putting to a lot of people with their eyes that are too wide apart and the gills that sometimes grow on their chests and the webbed fingers and toes. And while there are a lot of rumors about the strange things that the Kraskar get up to, back in the swamps where no one can see, there is a truth that's acknowledged of Kraskar are good to their word. No matter what they swear, they will do it. And if you have earned either a pledge of fealty or an oath of a promise from the Kraskar, you have done something very impressive to make sure that they honor that. And the last one included in this particular collection was the Arasta, which were desert dwarves. And it's been said the Arasta are some of the oldest dwarves that were actually made. They are hardy, they are relatively quiet. They will use all sorts of hand languages, but they're also particularly good at reading subtle alterations of the face. And so, Arasta can have entire conversations between each other just standing guard one night, whereas another individual will just assume they stood there stoically and never said a word. But it's all about understanding that what's going on beneath the surface of their culture, and understanding the areas of the world in which they come from and which have sort of shaped them into what they are today. And I thought these 5 openers obviously do not take up every kind of giant there is. If you've been playing the game for a while, there's at least another 5 or 6 more that I could realistically hit, with maybe 1 or 2 if I wanted to invent extra things for the setting. And I wanted to sort of leave that door open for game masters who liked the idea of making dwarves more unique, but maybe wanted to put their own spin on it without fighting any of the mythology I'd already put down. But at the same time, I wanted to provide enough that they didn't feel like they had to do their own homework and their own invention. If they didn't want to, they could just take what I had given them and sort of run with that. And that's just kind of a brief overview of Dwarves of Sundara. It's one of the 6 splat books I've done for Species of Sundara so far, each one which has 5 variations on the species, complete with religious leanings, what cultural norms they have, their history, some of their mythology, and with all of the player options to make them unique, and with occasional little bullet points on the side of which species they have relationships with based on where they live and the kind of history they've put together thus far in the setting. So check those out if you're interested. And if you have anything about the Sundara setting you're interested in, something you'd like me to cover in the future, or just something you think I should improve with these videos going forward, and for folks who haven't noticed, I've been messing with my lighting setup. Leave it in the comments below. Let me know. I'm trying to make these as engaging and interesting for folks as I can. So, yeah, look forward to hearing from y'all. And until then, happy gaming, everybody.